Ozarks is rich with folklore. The stories really kind of took on a different life. Like the story of the Ozarks Howler. The Ozarks Howler is described as being a bear-sized, dog-like animal with horns that has a blood-curdling scream. My name is D.A. Roberts. I was born and raised in the Ozarks, just outside of a little town called Lebanon, Missouri. Grew up on a farm. And saw the Patterson Gimlin footage in the early 70s. Had him in probably around 74, 75, first time I saw it, and was just absolutely captivated. And as a kid growing up in the country with, well, in those days, most folks that lived in the country had one, possibly two television channels. I didn't watch a lot of TV. I was mostly out and about on the farm. And, if I wasn't at school or doing chores, I was running in the fields and the woods. And would hear weird things in the woods. And I remember my grandparents telling me as a kid, "Don't be out there after dark; them boogers will get you." And it always kind of stuck in my head what they meant about that. Might have asked my dad about it. He's like, "Oh, that's just your grandparents. Don't worry about them." But the older I got, the more I started thinking there's really something out there. And my uncle Buddy, he married my mother's sister. He was full blood Cherokee. And I would ask him questions about it, and he wouldn't really talk about it while there was people around. But when I was about 8, maybe 9 years old, I went in the house for something, and he was in the house getting a glass of water. No, everybody else was outside because he lived way out in the sticks. When I say way out there, I mean his closest neighbor was about 2.5, 3 miles away, and he lived on a bluff above the Niangua River, out in the middle of nowhere. If you know where Eldridge, Missouri is, he lives about 5 miles outside of Eldridge. And Eldridge is not exactly civilization as most people think of it. Um, but I remember I went in and asked him about it another time, and he picked me up and he set me on his knee, and he looked around, made sure nobody else was listening, and he goes, and he called me by my full first name, which very few people ever really did in my lifetime. I'm not going to go into what my full initials are. I just go by DA. But he set me on his knee, and he called me by my first name, my full name, and he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to always remember this." I said, "What's that?" He goes, "They're out there, they're real, and they're on this property, and if you don't respect them, you're going to regret it." And he would start telling me little bits as I spent. He was like a second father to me. I spent a lot of time out there hunting and fishing and camping on his land because he had 160 acres right up against conservation land out in the middle of nowhere. And I hunted and fished that land and camped on it many times and had a couple of odd experiences on there. But his words always rang in my head. And after he was the really first time an adult actually said they believed these things were out there. From that moment on, I was just absolutely hooked, and I've been researching them ever since.
Hi, I'm Linda Eastburn of Linda Eastburn YouTube channel, and I have a new book out called Threshold to Encounters. It's about 40 years of research and experience with all of these wild cryptids that many of you I know have encountered yourself. You can find it on Amazon.com. Well, there are a lot of things along that Niangua River, and I know you're familiar
Yes,
with
there are.
the film we made, Byways of Bigfoot, along the Niangua with, mostly we of course, focused on Bigfoot, but you've researched a lot of different things along that river and other places as well. So tell me about some of your research projects that you've had specifically along that Niangua River.
Well, along the Niangua is a lot of different history. I mean, it was all originally Osage land. In fact, I believe the Niangua itself is named after an Osage chief. But the valley, and there's a valley called Moon Valley that's always been kind of near and dear to me. But that valley really holds a lot of, I almost want to say, I want to use the word mysticism. There's been a lot of weird sightings down there. Back in 2019, there was a case of cannibalism down there. Two men went to prison over it because they had been eating people for years. Um, and I've heard stories of disembodied spectral lights floating down the river. I know multiple people that have had Bigfoot sightings down there in Moon Valley. I remember camping as a teenager down there. We had something large pace around our tent the entire night, and that freaked out a bunch of teenagers out. I can tell you that. But we never saw it. It never came in close, but it was walking on two legs. And I don't know if it was, somebody in the valley or if it was a Bigfoot, but it certainly, made us feel like it was a Bigfoot. We were all armed, but we were all carrying like 22s for shooting squirrels and rabbits because that's all we were doing while we were camping, fishing, shooting squirrels and rabbits. So I wouldn't want to take a pot shot at one with a 22, but it freaked us out. I've heard of encounter stories down there where people have had fish stolen. Um, we went recently down there, went down there back in July with my friend Robbie Rains from South Carolina. And my oldest son plays, I don't know if you're familiar with an instrument referred to as the shofar. It's an Israeli horn, and it's said by a lot of researchers to hit certain frequency notes that will draw them in. And we played the shofar down there several times, and we got responses. We were picking them up on the parabolic mic, but they never got close. We could hear them in both directions in the valley. So I know they were within at least a couple of miles of us, but they never came closer. But that was during the dead of summer when a lot of people go down to Moon Valley during the day to swim because that's the Niangua was a cool spot to swim. The water's fairly deep, and local people like to go down there and swim. But this winter, there won't be anybody down there, and we're going to go down and try it again. But there was a number of Bigfoot sightings farther down the Niangua. My uncle had several sightings on his land, which is right along the Niangua. I had a couple of pretty wild experiences on his land. I had a deer stolen, and something approached my deer stand in the darkness, which there was no way it was anybody else. There was nobody on his land. Like I said, his nearest neighbor was 2.5 miles away, and it wasn't my uncle, and it wasn't anybody we knew because I was the only one out there hunting. But something approached my deer stand in the darkness and came right up behind the specific tree I was in. Uh, and I was setting up in a tree stand about 15 feet off the ground with no lights on. So it's not like somebody would have seen me. If somebody had just been walking through the woods, there's no way they would have known I was there. Um, but yeah, all along the night has been tons of things that have happened, including one Class A sighting that the BFRO reported on what's called Lake Niangua, which is a reservoir down near Hahatonka State Park on the Niangua River.
Yeah, I looked that up before we did the Byways of Bigfoot, and yeah, there have been several sightings along there, and even since we made that film, there have been other people come forward to talk about various Bigfoot sightings along the river. Now, I know you've researched more than just Bigfoot. You researched, Dogman, the Ozark Howler, and you have a lot of knowledge about kind of the folklore even in this area around all of these cryptids. So just tell me some about that.
Well, the Ozarks is rich with folklore. Um, Much like the Appalachian Mountains, the Ozarks were settled primarily by like Northern European, Irish, Scottish, a lot of that in this area. That's why there's so much bluegrass music in this area, is because bluegrass is actually derived from old Celtic folk songs. But a lot of those stories came with them. But when they met some of the native stories, the stories really kind of took on a different life. Like the story of the Ozarks Howler. The Ozarks Howler is described as being a bear-sized, dog-like animal with horns that stick out of the back of its head. Some people have described it as a hellhound, and they say that it has a blood-curdling scream that can be heard echoing through the valleys. And camping a couple of times, we've heard screams in the distance that kind of match that description, but we've never had a chance to get close to one. There have been multiple Ozark Howler sightings within half an hour's drive right here where I'm sitting, and I'm in southern Springfield. Um, there's two or three down near Branson. There was a Class A. Well, I guess Class A is using the BFRO terminology, but a visual sighting of one up near Rolla, Missouri, right close to a friend of mine's house. Some people caught one on a trail cam down near Branson, and the photos of that are pretty bizarre when you look at them. They had some wildlife experts from the um, exotic animal paradise come down to look at it, and they couldn't identify the species. They didn't know what it was. Some people also describe the Ozark Howler as being cat-like, but the horns are the really big differentiation because there's no species of cat or canine in the Ozarks that has goat-like horns sticking out of the back of its head. But allegedly Daniel Boone tracked and killed one up near Cuba, Missouri, and had it stuffed and mounted in his private collection. And after he passed away, supposedly his stuffed animal collection was taken by the Smithsonian and never heard from him again. But the Ozark Howler is heavy in the Ozarks folklore, and in fact, it's said that there's a secret society was made here in the Ozarks, and is now a worldwide society. But there's a secret society that still exists, that is built for the protection of the Ozarks Howler, and it's called the Concatenated Order of the Hoo-Hoo, which hoo-hoo is an old time, like late 1800s word for the howler. That's how people would refer to it. But the order still exists, and 2 U.S. presidents have been members.
I hadn't heard that. Tell me more about that secret organization. Yeah, I don't know much of it.
It's an interesting little organization when you start reading about it. The only way to join is by invitation only. They don't have an official, email them and try to join. You have to be invited, and you have to work in the forest industry. Um, Teddy Roosevelt first heard about it from one of the guys that rode with him up San Juan Hill, one of the Rough Riders, and he went with him back to Arkansas to learn more about it. In fact, it was said that Teddy set aside the Ozark National Forest, which is about 1.5 million acres, as a preserve specifically for the Ozarks Howler. And I believe the other U.S. president was Woodrow Wilson, if I remember correctly. I'd have to double check that, but there have been at least 2 U.S. presidents that have not only been members but helped lead that organization.
That'd be a pretty limited group of people if you have to work for the forestry department.
No, not the forest. You have to work in the forest industry, like a timber cutter. Or you have to work in an industry that is related to the forest.
So people who would have some reason to be actually out there in the environment of the Ozark Howler itself.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Well, there have been so many Bigfoot reports in Missouri all over, but one of them, and I'm sure you're familiar with the blue man,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
of
the
the
Ozarks Blue Man.
glistening coat. Yeah,
That's down in
tell
Douglas
us what you know
County.
about it. Yeah,
The Ozarks Blue Man's been seen for generations. It was first seen down in the Douglas County area, down near. I don't know if you're familiar with Ava, but funny thing is a lot of people refer to Bigfoot as a booger, especially in the South. You hear it more down there. They refer to them as boogers. Even to this day, they still call Ava Booger County.
yeah.
But it was cited by a number of people. They said that its pelt was so dark black that it almost looked blue, thus the blue man term. It was known for stealing livestock, carrying a large club, and people have seen it along some of the river valleys in Douglas County, and they still report it occasionally. And yes, I do believe it is a Bigfoot type creature, but I think it has certain differences, especially that it is generally seen carrying a big wooden club.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard about the club aspect of that. Of course, it's been reported all the way back to the 1800s, I think.
Yeah, I think the earliest report was in the 1860s.
Yeah, and that area all down in southeast Missouri, that whole not really in the Boot Hill, but that whole Douglas County, Booger County area, and all around there is just very, very it's very sparsely populated. There's not a lot of people there in the 1800s. It certainly would have been. So there was a lot of woods and a lot of rivers and a lot of places for them to multiply and hide.
Yeah, well, even today in the 2020s, most of the quote unquote big towns down in those smaller counties may only have a couple thousand people. There are no big cities down in that area until you get clear down into the Boot Hill and run into like Cape Girardeau and that area down there. But between here and there, nothing very big. I think the biggest one is West Plains, and West Plains isn't huge. Uh, but one thing people fail to realize about the Ozarks, is at one time the Ozarks were the tallest mountain range on the planet. They're also one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet, and over time, erosion has kind of brought them down to what they are. But there's still deep valleys and hills and tons of caves out there. And when people start thinking that, oh, we've got too many towns and cities, there's not enough habitat for them, what people don't realize is when Teddy Roosevelt created the National Park Service, he set aside 88 million acres for habitat. And in the Ozarks alone, between the Mark Twain National Forest and the Ozarks National Forest, that's about 5 million of that.
That's huge.
That's a
Huge.
lot of
And
land.
lots of game out there, lots of riverways out there. When we did the byways film along the Niangua, we really focused on that they travel on those rivers as part of their transportation type of means. So what do you understand about that?
Well, I think they not only use rivers and lakes, but I think they also use cave systems. Missouri's riddled with caves. In fact, they've recently discovered that the Mammoth Cave system, which runs under Tennessee and Kentucky, they believe now extends all as far north as Maine and as far south as Carlsbad Caverns. I think they're using a lot of these deep caves as highways. But if you look up a map of the Mississippi River and its tributaries, it's actually pretty mind blowing when you look at it because it covers pretty much everything from the Rockies to the Appalachians.
It's huge. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's huge. And we don't really know what happens in those enormous cave systems, what might live down there and what might hide down there easily from any kind of human access.
Right. I was kind of an amateur speleologist. I was in a cave crawling club back when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and we crawled through a lot of caves here in Missouri. I was, much younger and slimmer man at the time. I don't know that I'd be able to crawl into some of the places we went when I was younger, but I went through a lot of caves here in Missouri. And one thing I did notice is that there's only so far you can go. Um, going on a cave crawling expedition is not like going camping or going, let's say you were taking an expedition up the Amazon. If you have regularly spaced campsites on the Amazon, you can have supplies brought in, but it doesn't work that way going underground. You are limited by how far you can carry supplies. In order to make a large foray deep underground, you've got to go in, establish a base camp, and then supply it. Making trips back and forth, and then from that base camp, you have to have another team that's resupplying the base camp, and you take another journey deeper into the cave and take supplies because you're limited by what the amount of food and water you can carry. So we can only get a few days in without the supply chain getting really strained. So we've never been very deep. We just don't know how deep those caves go. I mean, for example, you don't know, do you know about the Oglala Aquifer?
I don't.
The Oglala Aquifer is a underground lake, freshwater lake that supplies water to 6 states. It's a massive underground lake that runs from New Mexico, from the border of New Mexico and Texas, up through Kansas, through parts of Oklahoma, and up into Nebraska and part of Iowa. It is a massive underground lake, and it's connected to all kinds of caves.
Yeah, that's kind of an amazing idea. And that can be dangerous going into those caves. I mean, because they can flood. I've heard of people drowning inside caves after spending some time there just because the flash floods can just come so quickly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can get trapped in a cave or even drown when the cave fills with water. Flash floods are a constant danger. And another thing you've got to worry about is air quality. You can get so far underground that the air is much thinner. You can get lightheaded and pass out, or you can run into pockets of methane gas, which can overpower people. Or if you hit a spark, methane will go up and kill everybody. But there's a lot of danger involved in going underground. And I think one of the things that we've talked about on our show, me and Robbie and Doc and Steve and my son Noah, we all kind of pitched this idea around is we think that a lot of Bigfoot wood knocks, quote unquote wood knocks, are actually popping their tongue. And we think that they use that underground as a form of echolocation, um, because there are people who are humans who have gone blind, who have learned to make clicks and pops to navigate with. There's videos floating around of a guy that taught himself to ride a bicycle through a obstacle course, and he's absolutely completely blind. And he did that by clicks and popping his tongue. And if they're using that as a form of echolocation, then they're going to be able to go a lot deeper than we'll ever be able to go.
Well, I remember when we were filming it, you were on my show Intuitive Journeys out by the Fellows Lake area, and we heard at that point a wood knock. That's what we called it, was a wood knock. It sounded like one of those Bigfoot knocks, and I'd never heard one before. And it was kind of an interesting sound because it was really loud. And I remember saying, "What was that?" And you were the only one in the group that knew that was a wood knock type of sound. Since then, I've heard of several Bigfoot sightings in that general vicinity. So it could have been, it was midday. If it was, they would have had to have been across the lake, I think, because there wasn't any kind of wooded area for them to really hide close to where we were.
My son Noah and I go out there to Fellows Lake to film occasionally, and we on more than one occasion we've heard wood knocks out there. Uh, and granted, Fellows Lake is pretty close to Springfield, but like you said, it's pretty heavily, it's very heavily wooded out there. Uh, and considering the farther toward Fairgrove and Stockton Lake you go, the thicker it gets. So there would be plenty of places for something like that to hide out there and to avoid detection.
Exactly. Now, also in that Fellows Lake area, there have been a lot of UFO sightings and activity. Have you heard of any incidences where Bigfoot or these other cryptids and UFOs have any kind of connection with one another?
I've heard a few stories where people said that they'd seen Bigfoot and then either shortly before or shortly after saw lights in the sky. I've never had that experience, and I'm not a big ufologist. I don't really, it's just something that's never been very interesting to me. I mean, I believe alien life is out there, but I'm more concerned with terrestrial life. But I think that if there is alien life that's capable of crossing vast interstellar distances that have come here to study us, I think they would study all upright hominids. So I think the seeing the lights, they're probably just watching the Bigfoot like they watch us.
A lot of them also talk about orbs in the woods, and that seems to be some kind of a natural thing in wooded areas because they're just so readily reported. And they seem to have a kind of consciousness about them. They seem to interact with people. Have you ever experienced anything like that?
Well, you've got the legends of the Will-o'-the-Wisp and things like that, and of course, if you've ever been down by Joplin and Neosho to see what they call the spook light down there are lots of places that report these strange lights. I've seen lights in the woods that I wasn't sure what they were. It looked like a lantern bobbing along. But by the time we got over there, there was nothing there. So I don't know. I can't say for sure I've seen an orb because it could have been a person. They just slipped away. Uh, it wasn't like we were calling out to them trying to get them to answer us, but it just weird lights in the woods are fairly common. If you camp, especially if you, because when we camp, we don't camp at like campgrounds. If you go down by Silver Dollar City or Table Rock Lake, there are dozens of little campgrounds, and they're really nicely kept, and they're nice places to stay with your family. But if you're doing any kind of research, that's not the kind of camping we're talking about. We've gone miles deep into the Mark Twain National Forest and set up primitive camps. Um, and we've heard some pretty interesting audio, and we've seen those lights in the woods. We just don't know what they are. The Native American legends abound about the lights in the woods, about them being the spirits of lost people and lost warriors who were lost in a snowstorm and that kind of thing. But there's a lot of lore around it, so it's impossible to dismiss it and say, oh, that's just hokum. People are making up the stories because there's just too much of it happening. But I think what we're going to discover is that a lot of this land that we take for granted was once held sacred by the natives, and I think we're doing a great disservice ignoring their wisdom.
A lot of the native philosophy on Bigfoot is that they live in two worlds, that they're here, but they're also able to just, like move into some kind of a spiritual world and kind of come and go. Have you experienced or heard of that phenomenon?
Well, I've never experienced what people call portals. I've always believed that they're just well, I'm a retired cop. I've worked in law enforcement for decades, and I've just I've always been a physical evidence guy, and I'm not saying portals can't exist because CERN has opened one, so we know portals are a thing. There's no other animal in the animal kingdom that does it, so I'm skeptical until I see it myself. I mean, I'm not doubting anybody when they say they saw one, but it's not something that I've ever experienced. I have talked to Native Americans, guide right down here at Miami, Oklahoma, who said he was walking down a trail going to one of his favorite fishing spots along a creek, and he rounded a corner and there was a Bigfoot standing in the trail, and he said he looked at him surprised and he was surprised, and he said all at once it put its hand up over its face like that and stepped back in the woods and disappeared. And I said, "Do you think it like cloaked or went through a portal?" Because I was wanting to know if that's what he meant. He said, "No, absolutely not." He said, "Once that thing broke the plane, once it was in the trees, I couldn't see it anymore." He says, "I heard it move away, but I couldn't see it anymore." He said, "I think these things are just masters of camouflage."
Well, they do seem to blend extremely well. And also the way that they tend to move, they can disguise themselves almost looking like a stump or a log. A lot of people seem to see what they think is a log or a stump. And it's actually then they realize, oh no, that's not that's a Bigfoot. So they can remain perfectly still, blend in with their environment, and you honestly cannot see them. The human eye is designed to pick up movement, and if they're
Right.
not moving, it's really difficult for us to determine.
Well, I grew up deer hunting, and every deer I ever shot, I only saw that deer because it moved. If they're sitting completely still in the brush, they are very hard to detect, especially at any kind of range. And that's a deer that is just a known animal that we're completely aware of that doesn't have any special shape shifting abilities or anything like that. It's just a deer, and when it's set still in the fall brush, it is very difficult to get a bead on one. A lot of researchers have been coming forward. I've talked to researchers here in the Ozarks. I've talked to researchers down in Florida. I've talked to some in Texas, and Doug Hychek from Monster Quest have all talked about finding hair samples that have what's called a clear hair shaft. Not all of the hairs, but some of the hairs interspersed among the hair sample they found have clear hair shafts. Now, if that's the case, if Bigfoot have a clear hair shaft system in a mix among their fur, they're doing that with the next generation of ghillie suits for the military. They're putting fiber optic slivers in among the ghillie suit because that clear fiber optic, that clear hair shaft, picks up and redirects the color of the light around it. So if it's standing in front of a green tree, it's going to look green. If it's standing among wildflowers, it's going to pick up little highlights of those colors of those flowers. Those clear hair shafts, I think, what gives this thing its advantage and its ability to disappear practically right before our eyes. Those clear hair shafts are absolutely amazing. If you watch the Paul Freeman footage, MK Davis has done some really great breakdowns on that. But there is one scene where Paul Freeman, you see the large black male Bigfoot step out, and Freeman's filming it, and it's looking at him. And once it realizes he's watching him, and Freeman's just standing and filming, it steps in front of a large pine tree, stops moving, and vanishes. Yeah, right on camera. You can't even see it, just disappears. And he's like, "Where did it go?" And he starts walking toward it. And once he gets, another 10 yards closer, it realizes he's still coming. It steps away from the tree and starts moving again. It didn't flash through a portal. It didn't hit, Scotty didn't beam it up. It didn't hit a button on his utility belt and turn invisible. It just stopped. It stopped moving, and those clear hair shafts picked up and redirected the green behind it, and it blended in perfectly with the tree until it started moving again.
That's probably why a lot of people report seeing them like crossing the road or something like that, where their background or they don't have the foliage of the
Right.
wood to reflect off of their hair. So they're more visible in that environment, but very seldom are they visible in a wooded environment.
Correct. And, if they're in among their element, I think the only way you're going to see one is that they want to be seen. Um, and a lot of times people talk about seeing a lone Bigfoot by the river or by the lake or on a trail. Um, I think I think it's there for a reason, and it's probably to warn you out of that area because a lot of researchers believe these things don't move alone unless it's a rogue element that's been cast out of its clan, but they tend to move in family units. So if you're seeing one, I wouldn't take a shot at it because there's probably others in the area.
Exactly. And sometimes when, they don't seem to be overly dangerous, but when they do seem threatening or trying to intimidate you, oftentimes it's because there's a family unit close by and they don't want you getting close to the young ones.
Yeah, I think that by and large, they probably would give us a wide berth. But if we're encroaching on their territory, or if it's an old one that's sick and can't hunt anymore, I'd say, there's a good high likelihood that we might be on the menu. Um, they're like any other animal. Well, look at people, for example. People are supposed to be the dominant species, the higher intelligence, but how many serial killers exist among humans? How much crime is perpetrated against other humans on a daily basis? So there are people out there, and I hate to say this, but there are people out there who are just bad. And I think the same thing happens when you deal with other creatures as well. One example I like to talk about is I was hiking up in the Rockies with some friends one time, and I kept telling them I hear a bear, and they're like, "Nah, you don't hear a bear." I'm like, "I'm telling you, I'm hearing a bear." And I was at the point I was up front with my walking stick, and we rounded a corner in the trail, and I almost bumped into a grizzly bear. I mean, I was nose to nose with it. I play this little game with my dog where I reach out and I boop him on the nose. I go boop, and he'll go, and then he'll lean forward and I'll do it again. He'll do it again. I do that with my dog all the time. I was close enough to do that with a grizzly bear. I could have just went and popped him on the nose. Of course, it probably would have not ended well for me, but it was one of those moments where it looked at me and I looked at it, and I could, it's like you get that little connection where I'm thinking, oh crap, it's a bear, and he's thinking, oh crap, it's a human, and he went one way and I went the other. And but had that been right before or after hibernation time when that bear was hungry, or if it had cubs with it, different story. At that point, I'm bear chow, because bears, especially grizzlies, will take people. It doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. A great example is that guy they used to call the Grizzly Man was doing research up in Alaska. He thought he knew that group of grizzlies, camped among them one too many times, and got eaten, him and his girlfriend. So even animals we think we know can and will eat people. There are large predators out there that to them we're just meat. Um, mountain lions have dragged people off. Bears. We've got wolves. We've got coyotes. Coyotes have eaten people. We're generally not top of their list. But there was a story, I believe it was in Yellowstone, where a husband and wife were hiking, and she rolled her ankle like pretty bad and couldn't walk on it. And they weren't far from where they'd parked the car. And he said they couldn't get a cell signal. She said, "Why don't you hike back to the car and see if you can get a signal and get somebody in here to help me out of here?" And because she couldn't walk, she sat down on a log and waited for him. And he was gone about 2 hours. And when he came back, she'd already been killed and eaten by coyotes.
Yeah, when they're hungry,
Yeah,
when they're
exactly,
desperate and they
exactly.
need food, I guess everything that is moving could be possibly a target for them. Um,
I don't necessarily think that we're on the menu all the time for a Bigfoot or a Dogman, but any other predator is an opportunistic predator. We look at that in the bear kingdom. We looked at it in wolves. If something presents itself and it's an easy meal, they're going to take it.
That's true. I 100% agree. So, what do you think about the idea that Bigfoot might be snatching people in these national forests, and that with all the missing people that happened?
If you're referring to the missing 411,
Right.
um, I think it's highly likely that we've got cryptids involved in it. I don't think it explains all of it, But I think when you look at the totality of the circumstances all the missing people, and David Paulides is not profiling every person that goes missing in a national park, just ones that meet certain odd criteria. And just those alone, if you look at those, yeah, I'd say a good chunk of those are probably cryptid related.
What do you think happens to them? Do you think they're killed? Do you think they're captive and taken back to a camp, or what do you think happens?
I don't think there's any one specific answer for that. You know, a lot of Native American lore talked about Bigfoot coming into camp and abducting women, children at times. Some of them said it was to eat as food, and then there are other stories of Native American women turning back up at camp months later with a hairy child. So I think it's depends on the circumstance. If they're wanting food, they'll take them for food. But if it's a young male without a mate or a young female looking for a partner, I think it's very likely, like the Albert Osman case. The Albert Osman case, he was abducted because they wanted a companion for the daughter of their clan and didn't have anything else. I firmly believe that's why they didn't just eat him right away.
Exactly. Well, there is this story about someone, I'm not sure what country it's in, that claims that they were abducted and they did have a child with a Bigfoot, and they had a hairy child. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Well, there's that case in Russia, that was Zana the Wild Woman, where this village in Russia captured what they said was what they referred to as a wild woman, that she didn't wear clothes, she was covered in hair, and they kept her prisoner in the village. And over the years, a few of the villagers had kids with her. And even her offspring were known as being particularly large and very strong. Um, and they had to start taking the kids away from her because she would take them down to the stream and try to wash them in ice cold water. And a lot of the baby, some of the babies had passed away because of that. But the offspring of Zana were all known to be, swarthy, uh, kind of Neanderthal looking, very powerful men.
Well, in every country, there is some form of what we would call a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or whatever, but some hairy creature that is very large. They take on different characteristics in different parts of the world, but um, give me an idea of the numbers and the types that are around the world.
Oh, there's if you look at the types of Bigfoots, you've got the Alma, the Almasty, the Yowie, the Yeren, and those are the Yowies in Australia, the Alma, the Almasty, and the Yeren are in China and Mongolia in that area. Then over in the Middle East, you've got the Barmanu. There's the Yeti, obviously. If you look up different names for Bigfoot in different parts of the world, you will find hundreds of different names. Every tribe of Native Americans in North America has a different name for one. The Lakota referred to it as the Shiatonka. And then you've got Skookum, and there's just literally hundreds of names for these creatures all over the world. So if this is a hoax, there's a society out there that has spent probably billions of dollars just traveling the world hoaxing people in remote corners of the world. So the likelihood of that is extremely rare. But when you look at the sheer volume of Bigfoot sightings over the decades, it's impossible to just look at it and ignore it. And even as a cop, I mean, we've sent people to prison on eyewitness testimony, but why is it so suddenly useless when it comes to cryptids? Um, and the interesting thing is just so many of these stories, you just and they're from so many different walks of life, you just can't ignore them all. And if you took, out of the thousands of stories and only said, okay, these three are true, the rest are made up, that still means it exists.
Exactly. And there's so many of them. I have like 350 interviews just on my channel alone of people who have had some form of an encounter or an experience with Bigfoot or something else that would be considered a cryptid. And then there's the Patterson Gimlin film. I mean, what do you think of that?
The Patterson Gimlin film is really the first thing that made me interested in cryptids. I was 4 or 5 years old when I watched it for the first time. and it was just absolutely mind blowing. And I believe it's still one of our best pieces of footage. That with that and the Paul Freeman footage, I think those two are just absolutely magnificent pieces of footage. If y'all haven't had a chance to watch the Patterson Gimlin or the Paul Freeman footage, just Google them and watch them. Uh, they At the time the Patterson Gimlin footage was made, that was in the late 60s. The height of Hollywood special effects was the movie Planet of the Apes. That was considered some of the best high budget special effects they were capable of. And they showed that footage to the special effects artists that made Planet of the Apes. And they said, there's no way we could duplicate that. We don't know. The technology does not exist to make a suit like that. That has to be real.
Exactly. And, some of the analysis that MK Davis has done on that, the movement and the muscle and all of that with Patty in the Patterson Gimlin film, it's like that is just amazing how he has worked through the footage on that to explain how a human cannot move that way.
Right. We're just not built the way that thing is.
Now, he also has some controversy in some of the explanations he has about what happened that day with maybe they were hunting, a group were hunting maybe Bigfoot. There was some were killed. There's a bloody pond. Have you any opinion on that?
I don't know if MK Davis has studied that film far more than anybody I know. I don't know. I've never seen any footage to back up the possibility of others being killed. But I know our government has known about these things for a long time. What people fail to realize is when we start talking about Bigfoot, they're like, "How come we don't hear about Bigfoot before the Patterson Gimlin footage?" Well, the term Bigfoot was coined in 1957 after Jerry Crews found large footprints around his logging camp, and he cast them. He took them to a local newspaper, and they said big footprints found in the mountains, and the phrase Bigfoot was coined. Prior to 1957, they used terms like wild man or hairy man, or even wood woes. Look up some of those terms. Look up hairy man or wild man newspaper clippings from the 1800s. There are thousands of them. I mean, there are just literally thousands of wild man seen, wild man attacks farm, wild man takes sheep. There's just thousands of those old stories from newspapers all across the US long before anybody ever heard the word Bigfoot. Same thing with Dogman. Dogman, that term didn't exist until the 90s. It was coined by a radio DJ out of Michigan when talking about the Michigan Dogman. Prior to that, they were known as werewolves or wolfmen or the cynocephali. Cynocephali have been talked about as far back as the Roman and the Greek empires. The Romans and the Greeks both detailed fighting what they called dog-headed warriors during their travels in northern Africa and in the Indus Valley of India. These dog-headed warriors have been documented on other expeditions. Both Marco Polo and Christopher Columbus and their travels talked about encountering cynocephali on islands. Um, in the Catholic iconography, Saint Christopher, no, yeah, Saint Christopher is known as the dog-headed saint. Um, if you look up pictures, look up the dog-headed saint, you will see all these Catholic paintings from the church that depict him having the head of a dog. It said he was cured of the cynocephalitis once he performed his first miracle, that God had cured him. But in the early depictions of Saint Christopher, he's known as the dog-headed saint. Um, so there's lots of historic references to these things. In fact, are you familiar with the Piri Rice map?
I'm not. No.
The Piri Rice map belonged to an admiral, a Turkish admiral named Piri Rice. Piri Rice had this map in his collection, and several other people have gotten copies of it. But the original Piri Rice map is in a museum in Istanbul. We only have a fragment of the map remaining. Most of the map has been lost. But they started looking at this map in the 1970s, trying to figure out what it was a map of because it didn't match any coastlines. And they believe that the map itself is actually Piri Rice had a copy of a much older map. So the U.S. Navy starts checking this map out in the 1970s. They're like trying to figure out what it is because it had trade routes marked and showed ships. Um, so Also in 1972, the U.S. Navy was doing sonar soundings of Antarctica, and they discovered that the Pura Ice map is a map of Antarctica with no ice on it. And in the margins, and I have a copy of the Pura Ice map over here on my shelf. In the margins of the Pura Ice map are both Bigfoot and Dogman-like creatures.
Yeah, it's as if they have been around forever. They
They've been
have
around
been
for as
part of
long as
our
we have.
world. Yeah. So it's amazing that we haven't had more interaction with them. But a lot
I
of
think
people
we
don't talk
have.
about it. A lot of people
I
just
think
don't
we
talk
have.
about it. Yeah.
I would say probably as much as 75 to 90% of Bigfoot encounters are never reported.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of people I talk to say they went years before they ever talked about it. And we have so much now with YouTube and with things on TV that I think people are feeling more comfortable admitting that they've actually seen or had an encounter with a Bigfoot or a Dogman or any other of these cryptids.
I agree. I think a lot of people have felt far more comfortable with, you've got a lot of shows on cable now about Bigfoot. We've see a lot more Bigfoot in the mainstream media. We see more movies about Bigfoot. Then you've got shows like, channels like yours and mine that we talk about cryptids. And, I think a lot of people have felt a lot more comfortable coming forward, but I still think the overwhelming majority of people just don't even want to talk about it.
That's true. I think a lot of people have feel like they're going to be ridiculed or humiliated by talking about something that's not supposed to exist. But a lot of people now are saying, "Yeah, we saw that, or we heard that," or and some of the reports that I've had there again since we did the film Byways of Bigfoot, I've had some Bigfoot sightings come forward. They didn't know what they were dealing with. These happened maybe in the 60s, the 70s. There wasn't any type of information much available in that period of time that was just readily available for every person. And they had an encounter with a Bigfoot on their property, but they had no idea what they were dealing with.
That's why if you look at those old newspaper articles from, the late 1800s and early 1900s, you see terms like wild man or hairy man, because they didn't know what it was. A lot of people, and I often wonder, in as pioneers moved farther and farther west, how many of them encountered creatures like that, or how many went missing because of that. Because the life expectancy for a pioneer wasn't always that great. Well, look how many people just, like, for example, just off the top of my head, uh, trying to remember the name of the group, the cannibal incident up in the Colorado mountains.
The
Um,
Donner
yeah, the Donner,
Party.
yeah, the Donner Pass incident. Uh, they ran into hardship, and that party pretty only a few of those folks came out of that. But well, granted, there wasn't a cryptid involved in that story, but what other times did something like that happen, that people got trapped and just picked off, or lone travelers out and late at night just didn't make it to their destination. And back then there was really no way to report it. I mean, before the telegraph, you were lucky if you could get a letter out to any of the outposts by Pony Express. So news just didn't travel well. So if somebody went missing, people may never know.
That's true. Well, going back to the Dogman and Hellhound, what do you think the correlation is or connection between cemeteries and this creature, dog-like creature?
I've often wondered that. I really don't know if I've got a good answer for that. I know in Egyptian mythology, Anubis and his brother Wepwawet both had the head of, well, in Anubis's case, the head of a jackal, but Wepwawet had the head of a wolf, and they were both associated with the underworld. I don't know if there's something about that, if there's a connection to the underworld, or if it's something as simple as they smell death and decay. I mean, we have cadaver dogs that we can take out and to search for missing bodies where that might have been buried out in the middle of nowhere. We have dogs that are trained to smell out cadavers. It could possibly be that they're just responding to the smell of the cadaver, looking for bones, or it could be something far more sinister. It could tie into the underworld. It could tie into the next life. I don't have a good answer for that. I wish I did, but it's just we don't know enough to say anything definitive.
Exactly. I'm assume you have heard the Sierra Sounds.
Mhm.
And what do you
Yeah,
think of those?
I think the Sierra Sounds are possibly some of the best recordings done, um, because they had a Navy cryptolinguist and analyze the Sierra Sounds, and on the analysis, he discovered that there are parts of that recording that are both above and below what human voices are capable of producing. And that alone should tell us it wasn't made by a human. But some of those sounds are just it would be almost impossible for us to make with our throats, because our voice boxes just aren't made that way. But especially when we're getting above and below human hearing range, we just it's again, it's not something that humans are built to do. So I think the Sierra sounds are a very great example of some of the noises that these things can make. And in fact, I've heard people that have described what they refer to as the samurai chatter from those files, having heard something similar in the Mark Twain. Um, I've heard. Yeah, now we took an expedition back into Combs Ferry here in Missouri, and Combs Ferry is a campground. It's been shut down for like 35 or 40 years. The Army Corps of Engineers won't develop the land. They won't reopen the campsite, and they went so far as bulldozing off the entrance. You can't even get in there. So we snuck in by boat and went in late at night, and we heard vocalizations in there. We had rocks thrown at us. We found animal parts up in trees, um, and not like a mountain lion. These were trees that were too small to support a large weight. We found the front legs of a deer that had literally been twisted off, not torn off, not cut off, twisted until they snapped loose, and still had a big chunk of the pelt attached to it where it had been torn free. And that was stuck in a tree at head level, right where we could see it. We also found part of a fish that was stuck in a tree, again at head level. And I believe those were trail markers. I think that we were being warned out of that area. Because the blood on the deer was still red. And I don't know if you're familiar with what happens with blood when it dries, but it oxidizes. It starts kind of turning a rusty brown. The blood was still red. We've got pictures of all of that. Um, but there were no flies, there were no maggots. They weren't rancid. They hadn't barely recently been put there, and bears don't do that. Mountain lions do take kills up a tree, but the tree itself is only about that big around, not big enough to support a mountain lion, and the branches the leg was hung on were only about yay big around. So that was deliberately put there by something with hands. We heard vocalizations, and we could hear. Well, we had a parabolic mic going, and we could hear chatter, but it wasn't like that. My son described it as sounding almost like radio chatter. Um, it was garbled, and you couldn't make out the words, but you could hear there was a conversation going on back in the woods away from us, but you couldn't understand any of the words involved. Um, we Unfortunately, we weren't able to get a recording of that because the parabolic was picking it up, but I don't have a way to record from the parabolic yet. I'm working on that. But we are planning on going back in there again once the weather cools off and the bugs aren't so bad, because we were swarmed with bugs back in July.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think about the massacre at LBL?
I think that's an interesting case, and I believe it actually happened because on their deathbed, a couple of state troopers came forward and talked about it. I've been at LBL. I had a sighting in LBL. I actually saw a dog man in LBL, on the northern part of LBL. Come to find out, it was probably within a few hundred yards of where that incident happened, where the family was supposedly killed. It was near an area called Demumbers Bay, and I tell you, LBL is like no other place I've ever been. It is bizarre. We stayed across from LBL in a little town called Grand Rivers, and there was a campground right near where we were at. We stayed in a cabin. Uh, and there were, deer walking around past the cabin. We were seeing all sorts of animals like raccoons and possums. There was plenty of animals all around us in Grand Rivers. But you cross that bridge over the canal into LBL, and there was nothing. I didn't see so much as roadkill. I didn't see a single animal in northern LBL the whole time I was there.
It's amazing. So I know you have done a massive amount of research and you have a large collection of written books out there. Tell us what you have and how people can find you.
Okay. Well, you can find it at daroberts.net or on Amazon. I do write fiction. To let people know that right now. But I have spent decades researching to get the behaviors of the creatures right. I've always wanted to write fiction, and I would do plan on doing some nonfiction books as well. We're working on a compilation books of, like you mentioned earlier, Bigfoot around the world under different names of Bigfoot. We're planning on doing a nonfiction book that deals with that subject, and then we've got some other stuff planned as well. But I've got multiple series out that have cryptids involved in the series. Apex Predator series, the Codename Wild Hunt series, the Lakeview Man series, Dark Frontiers series. I've got multiple series out. 32 books currently in print, and I hope you guys will check them out. I think you'd enjoy them.
And how can they find these and buy them?
You can find anything on daroberts.net or on Amazon.
And your YouTube channel is just D.A. Roberts?
No, our YouTube channel, we have a show twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8 p.m. The show's called DAX Machina, and you can find us on youtube.com. What's that? The little ampersand sign, the at symbol.
Yep.
youtube.com/DAX Machina podcast.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll let
Thank
you
you.
know when this comes out.
Awesome.
Talk later. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.